Building transit and building new stations is a critical part of development and redevelopment in our cities. Cities are constantly changing, and the last thing you want is to end up on your heels trying to chase some change that's already happened. Of course, this is standard practice in my city of Toronto. Let's talk about the worst example and what it can tell us about transit-oriented development and creating transit-oriented communities. When it comes to city planning, one of the signs of good planning is when you build the transit before you do development. Now that's rarely a single thing. It's usually a coordinated set of services and new infrastructure, which put transit centrally in a community before it's even developed. Good examples can include integrating local transit and building higher order transit connections like stations and new services so that when people move into a neighborhood, they already have options to use from day one. Now, while that might mean an inefficient or underused station or service in the early days, it will more than pay for itself in the future by causing people to build their lives around services that are available. A great example of how not to do this is the Humber Bay Shores neighborhood in Toronto. Humber Bay Shores is a neighborhood about 8 kilometers west of downtown Toronto on the lakefront of Lake Ontario. The community has seen massive growth, with tens of new residential towers being constructed over recent years, and many more planned in the future. And you know what? The neighborhood has been established around an existing streetcar route, as well as with local bus service connecting to the nearby Line 2 subway. So wait, what's wrong with this area? This is great, right? One of my personal bugbears with the way planners often look at transit is with this attitude of either covered or not covered, or served and not served. If there's a stop near where people live and work, then it's served. Great, transit accessible. It's on the back of this type of thinking that a lot of transit planning in Toronto and the rest of North America happens. And I'd argue to a large degree this is why Toronto was so enamored with tramways, and still is to some extent. You get miles and miles of transit and loads of stops for a low price. It looks great on a map and it sounds great on a spreadsheet. I'd actually argue that this is a very car-oriented way of looking at transit. As long as your roadway network is touching a destination, then it's served, right? People can drive their way to wherever they need to go. In much the same way, it seems planners sometimes look at transit as if, well, as long as there's a route connecting to a destination, then people will be able to use the entire transit system, no matter how easy or fast that is. The problem is very little thought goes into how people actually use transit, what the city looks like, and what makes people want to ride transit. So how does this all relate to Humber Bay Shores? Well, this neighborhood, located just about 8 kilometers from downtown on transit, is an hour away. The streetcar may look attractive on the street and may well be more comfortable than a bus, but it barely outperforms taking the bus all the way up to the subway, taking the subway across, and then taking subway line 1 down back into downtown. That is not good. And as it turns out, neighborhoods that feel further away, like Eglinton West, or Yonge and Lawrence, or the Danforth, are actually much closer via transit, despite being a similar distance away. These destinations are all roughly 20 minutes from downtown using the subway. I'd also note that none of them, including Eglinton West, which is a future subway interchange station, have nearly the level of intensification that we've seen at Humber Bay Shores. That's a huge failure in our ability to plan density where transit already exists. So yeah, part of the problem here is putting density in the wrong places, right? Now you might say, why are you putting so much emphasis on downtown? People clearly need to go to other places, and lots of trips don't go to downtown. Well, that's true and then not true. Downtown Toronto is still the most important employment cluster in the city, and not just the city, the entire country. And its intensification, largely forced by the lack of improving downtown transit connections, has meant that it's only become more and more important in the past several decades. Of course, downtown is important for tons of other reasons. It's got the most dense housing in the region. It's got the major event venues. It's got 2 of the largest universities in the country, as well as other educational institutions. It's got major destinations like the Eden Center and the Harbourfront, as well as museums. But perhaps most critically, from a transit point of view, it's where all rail lines lead. All of the GO Transit lines and the 2 most important subway lines all go to downtown Toronto. So being able to get to downtown efficiently is being able to go to the rest of the region efficiently. Now, this could have been changed by a new crosstown route north of Bloor Street, but unfortunately the Eglinton Crosstown is only going to be slightly faster than the subway when traveling through the core of downtown, much less to say the suburban areas of the subway. And the Eglinton Crosstown will be capacity constrained, so I don't see this downtown centricity in Toronto changing anytime soon. Of course, getting people to use transit for work and for their commute to school is also just the low-hanging fruit. It's the trip that most people are making most often, and I expect that to still be true after COVID. And since these travel patterns are quite predictable, they're easy to serve with transit. Once you get people taking their downtown commute, which is a lot of their travel on transit, it's much easier to get them to take their local trips on transit. The sort of reverse approach we seem to be taking in Toronto a lot of the time is trying to get people to make their trip to the grocery store on transit first, and then prioritizing the long distance trips later, which probably leads to no trips on transit, because the transit trip is going to be most convenient over the longest distance, where the subways and regional rail lines can start to be really useful and competitive with car travel. That's because if you can help it, you're not going to be making a short trip to a grocery store on the bus. Ideally, you can walk or cycle. Now, that's not the case everywhere, but all I'm suggesting is that when you have the choice, you want to make the fastest trip possible, and usually the fast transit trips are going to be the longer transit trips that utilize the rapid transit network. Of course, as well, part of densifying and redesigning our cities is about making those local trips less and less dependent on transit and making them walkable or bikeable. Of course, people living in a place like Humber Bay shores also probably expect to be able to get to downtown quickly, just because of simple geography. But that should go without saying. So is Humber Bay shores just an incredibly isolated neighborhood in terms of transportation options? No. Humber Bay shores essentially has its own exclusive highway ramps directly onto the Gardiner Expressway. They literally lead you straight into the center of the community. The Gardiner, which will get you downtown in 10 to 15 minutes depending on traffic, will take you right to your employer-subsidized parking lot in downtown Toronto. So if you're a young professional or even just an average person who's going to downtown, which many will be, are you going to stick it out 1 hour each way on the streetcar, or are you going to figure out a way to drive? If you drive, you'll spend over an hour a day more at home, relaxing, sleeping, seeing family, doing stuff you'd rather be doing rather than commuting. No matter how much better the streetcar is for the environment or the city or your pocketbook, see this video I did here, you're going to want to have a car. And frankly, I can't blame you. We can't expect people to choose transit if it's a painfully bad option when compared to driving. You shouldn't have to substantially lower your quality of life to use transit. If you have to, then we're not providing the right type of transit. But there's a happy ending to this story. Or an even worse beginning if you can believe it. You know what runs right through Humber Bay shores? The Lakeshore West GO train line. Every 15 minutes in both directions. Better yet, getting downtown is going to take about 10 to 15 minutes, just like with the car. Except you're not going to have to worry about traffic, and that travel time is going to be really consistent all day and all night. And yet, there's no station. Partly because Metrolinx argued it wasn't practical to have a station so close to Mimical, which is about 1 kilometer to the west. I don't necessarily agree, but I digress. But probably more fundamentally, because having a train station wasn't fundamental to the development of the community. The transit was not put first. Thankfully, as part of the neighborhood's largest series of development yet, a train station will be built. But for all the people who got a car or got into a lease, well, it's too late. We can't rely on people punishing themselves with bad transit to get the outcomes we want. We have to build great transit and have it convince people. Part of that is not just building local transit everywhere in the form of trams. Ideally, your city-level transit network is fast and high capacity. Fast because situations like this shouldn't happen where people are close to another location but have to travel immensely slow because of the dense nature of the city, and high capacity because if you provide that high-speed, high-quality transit, tons of people are going to ride it, as evidenced by our existing subway lines. So perhaps now you can see that despite a neighborhood having transit, being close to downtown, and being seemingly transit-oriented, Toronto created a vertical highway suburb. And this one is far from the only one. Fortunately, all is not lost. To the east of downtown, the Portlands area, which I covered in my Toronto Waterfront Mega Projects video, is being developed. And fortunately, before much of it is developed, East Harbour Station on both the GO Lakeshore East and Stouffville line and the Ontario line should be constructed. This should mean way better transit connections for people from the Portlands to downtown and the rest of the city, from day one. But this shouldn't be the exception, it should be the norm. Thanks for watching.